South Vietnam's Air Force panicked. Their pilots fled, littering the runway with discarded bombs. With the runway unusable, the fixed-wing airlift had to stop. The only way out was now by helicopter. A secret code was played over the airwaves to signal the beginning of the final evacuation.
Of a white Christmas.
White Christmas, that was the signal for people to assemble, to go to their evacuation assembly points. And so we turned on the radio on that. That was our radio. We turned that on, and it kept playing all day long and all night long, and it was still playing when we were leaving. It kept going. It kept going. Until somebody turned it off. That was after we left.
Key American personnel was summoned to the embassy.
And when I got to the embassy, I recognized the signs of what must have been evacuation planning. Safes were being blown, papers were being burned. So I walked in, I think it was to Wolf's office, and asked what was going on, and I was told we were evacuating. It was a pretty rapidly unfolding scene. I mean, you know, in some ways it's like watching television. You're sitting at an embassy window watching Augmented Marine Squad coming in on a helicopter. You're nothing but an observer at that time. All the forces at work were, if you will, external forces over which you had no control, authority, responsibility.
As word spread that the Americans were leaving, desperate Vietnamese started to gather outside the gates of the embassy.
At first it was open, the gates were open. Like I said, it was business as usual. Then by about 10 or 11 o'clock, after the Americans started showing up for the evacuation, a lot of the Vietnamese showed up. And we asked our commanders, well, what is the policy here? And they said basically anybody that had an American-issued identification card showing that that person at one time had been an employee, a Vietnamese employee, they would be allowed in with however many people they had. So we started doing that. And then the crowd started getting bigger and bigger, and we couldn't accommodate them that easily. The Vietnamese were so panicky, they were pushing and shoving, and the people in the back were squishing the people up to the front of the gates. It was just impossible to let anybody through at the time. They weren't being organized, they weren't staying in line, they weren't waiting their turn, they were taking cuts and everything. So we just eventually had to close that whole gate.
800 Americans and thousands of their Vietnamese staff and their families were still in the city. The evacuation plan was that buses would pick them up from pre-arranged evacuation points and take them to the airport. But the airport was surrounded by South Vietnamese soldiers, angry that the Americans were leaving them. One convoy of evacuees was led by Ken Moorfield.
I got back out to the air base, and then I was confronted by the guards. And then there was an officer in charge of the guards. And I kept insisting, you know, we've got to get on the base. I've got these people, we've got an evacuation. He was adamant that we were not going to get on the base, that he had orders that no one was to get on the base. And so finally he got sufficiently angered that he pulled out his pistol and cocked it and pointed at my forehead. And I said, "Ooh, okay. I think, you know, you got the force majeure here. We'll just go somewhere else." And so I turned around and took the convoy back into Saigon.
Kim was reluctant to go anywhere on that day.
My mother, she kept pushing behind. She said that you have to go to the embassy. But I myself, in my family, was the only one who had link with the American that I could do something. But I myself at that time, I thought that I already did everything. I submit my application and I'm waiting for my turn because they were evacuating everybody to leave by their turn. My mother, she kept pushing to say, at least escape for yourself because you work for the American, they come in, you will have to pay the price. I just say that, let's just wait. And I believe so strongly that the American would never leave us. And that's what the worst part, waiting for it to happen. But you were so helpless. You could not do anything to move people. Your life is at somebody's hand, and your fate is at someone else's hand.
All over the city were Vietnamese who worked for the Americans. They had done as they were told and gathered at the evacuation points. Now they waited for the Americans to do their part. 200 of them had gathered at the US Information Agency, which was headed by Alan Carter.
The next thought was, how do we get them out? The next thought was, get a bus to them if possible. And I remember talking to somebody at Mission Warden who was saying, Alan, we're running out of resources. We have nothing to, less and less to work with. The Vietnamese drivers were fleeing, deserting the buses. Other buses were simply breaking down. I realized this was not going to happen. Nobody was going to get over there. I finally got on the phone with one of them and said, the best thing to do, get out of the compound in small groups, 2s and 3s, get over to my villa, which is closer to the embassy, and which would presumably not be surrounded at that point. The next best and never materialized hope was that some of them would show up at the wall, outside the wall, where the Marines could, if you said, pull some people up over the wall. I went there for a short while, but nobody showed up that I recognized, and in effect kept up a hopeless kind of telephoning around trying to locate our locals. What does it feel like to be abandoned when you're scared to death of what's going to happen the next day when the feared North Vietnamese are going to be there? And to have your American power base disappear without getting you the hell out of there. It's a personal disaster for all of them. I'm not a person given to nightmares. I don't think I've ever had a nightmare in my life until the first 6 months I was back here. I awoke every night, and it was always a nightmare about abandonment. Always.
With the airport surrounded by hostile South Vietnamese soldiers, the only option was to evacuate from the embassy itself. Chinook helicopters began arriving at the embassy to evacuate the 2,000 people who had gathered there. More and more desperate Vietnamese were now turning up at the gates.
when we get to the embassy, we have like block of people from the fence all the way out. So we're way out here, not even next to the fence. So we wait there for the whole day. Basically, just look up the roof the whole day like that. I just see helicopter go in, go out, in and out. Occasionally, we look at the gate. We see people like climb up the gate and then get kicked down again and try to get up again. And then sometimes we see people with the paper fighting their way through the crowd. We wish we had those people with the paper, right? Tons of people, like a sea of black hair. We're just like, standing shoulder to shoulder. Sometimes, just do the shove and then we all kind of, go to one direction to the next. Almost like a rock concert. If people stay that close together.
It was getting nasty. And you tried to avoid eye contact because if you looked at them, you would hear the noise level rise. People would start calling your name and say, let me in, that type of stuff. And it was kind of heart-wrenching, It was like they were out there, you knew they were out there, you wish you could help them, like a person drowning, and you couldn't do anything about it. So it got to you a little bit.
In the meantime, helicopters go back and forth, and people just panicking. This is the one hope. It's one spot that they know that somebody escaped. And everybody in that big crowd wish that they are that somebody that getting, rescued.
Those lucky enough to have made it inside the embassy were flown out to the American fleet waiting out at sea. Desperate South Vietnamese Air Force pilots also headed out there. So many were trying to escape that there was no room for them to land. In the city, busloads of evacuees were now trying to make it to the embassy, but many of them were stuck in the chaos of Saigon.
There were probably 25, 30, 40 people out there in the streets, trying to get on that bus. And at that point, it was sheer panic. Kids were being pushed through the windows, it was absolute mayhem. They were paralyzed with fear, They were willing to basically pass their own children to someone on the bus who could get the child out of the country.
Trapped in the middle of the city, Moorfield decided to call the embassy to ask where he should go. He went into a nearby building, only to find hundreds more evacuees waiting to be picked up.
What I found was, several hundred people waiting in the courtyard who had been told that we were going to evacuate them, that we would help them, and they were there waiting. And as I walked in, everyone, who was all seated down, looked up at me, somewhat expectantly, and then you know, I had to walk through them. I think they became aware that I was not looking like I was there to help them. And indeed I wasn't, and I couldn't. So I made my phone call, and then I had to walk back through them on the way out. And I knew I was leaving them, and they knew I was leaving them. And that was the last hours home. I'm sure they never got out. So I recall it was late afternoon, around 5:30, 6 o'clock, when I finally was able to slip into the embassy.
I mean, there's a point at which everything just falls apart. But that didn't change the ultimate fact that there were key locals, Vietnamese, to whom a commitment had been made and where we failed in the commitment. Had we moved earlier and started evacuating more of them sooner, we might have gotten more of them out.
You know, whenever you have a tough situation like this, there are people, you know, who can't hack it. And this criticism, it's all too late, is a bunch of nonsense.
I don't feel vindictive about what happened in the last few hours. I mean, chaos is chaos, and there's not much you can do about it. But everything leading up to the chaos is where my anger still surfaces about it, and my feelings about it, because much more should have been done by then.
As night fell, the evacuation intensified. At its height, the helicopter was touching down every 10 minutes.
The helicopters would usually hold maybe 38 Marines, combat loaded. We were putting 60 or 70 Vietnamese in these helicopters. We were just packing them in as quickly as we could. We did that from like 3 in the afternoon till maybe 4 in the morning. All afternoon, all night long. And it was just a steady stream. There were a lot of panicky people, and we were trying to keep them calm, trying to assure them that, yes, there was a steady stream of helicopters coming. Eventually, you would get in line, and eventually you would get out. You just had to be a little patient.
The Vietnamese who hadn't made it inside the gate watched from the outside.
We were hoping for a miracle, that they would open all the gate and a big chopper would come down and pick everyone up. Which kind of foolish. Anybody in a clear mind would see that right away. But at that time, like I tell you, we all live in panic, so we don't see that. We don't see clear. So we still had that hope, because that's the only thing we have. So we wait for 6, 7 hours straight, right there, without moving an inch, until reality hit it.
Realizing he was never going to make it into the embassy, Long made his way home through the streets of Saigon.
So we make our way back to the car. The car was totally stripped. The wheel come off already. The window broken, the radio is gone. Even the seat is gone. And then so we had to think about how to get there to our house. The planning to survive the trip home. You see people looting everywhere, gunfire. You know, anybody with a gun can, rob you at any time they want to. Yeah, there's a lot of burning. There's a lot of smell burning through in the air. And it's dark. You don't see anything. So you're kind of guessing your way, you run this direction, that direction. So our concern is to survive that night.
After several hours, Long made it back to his family's house on the outskirts of the city.
We wait. We just wait there, and then slowly people come home and we're a bit happier. And finally, all our family make it home. At least, safe for one night. And we're very happy that we're all safe. Whoever can sleep, sleep, and whoever cannot sleep, just sit up and talk the whole night. And lucky for us, we still have some rice and some pumpkin and some peanut. Yeah. We're one of the lucky family. We still have food.
Ambassador Martin was trying to keep the evacuation going as long as possible to save the maximum number of Vietnamese. Washington wanted to end the evacuation as quickly as they could. Martin was told there would be only 19 more helicopters. He was ordered to get the rest of the Americans out and leave everyone else behind.
It was clear that the end was coming within hours. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, the ambassador and I went to the communications station in the embassy, and we wrote right there, and the communicator was typing out the message on the machine, sent our last message, which said, plan to close embassy at about 4:30 local time. Due to the necessity to destroy the communications gear, this will be the last message from Embassy Saigon. At about 4:30, a very peremptory order came in starting from the White House in Washington that the ambassador and the remaining staff are to leave on the next helicopters.
I said, Ambassador, they're saying that you have to be on this helicopter, and he kind of looked at me dispassionately.
And the ambassador had these cool blue eyes, and he looked down at me, and I had a bayonet on the end of my rifle. And he says, oh, well, it's coming to that now. And I said, yes, sir, it is. And he was just very cool and very quiet. He wasn't ruffled at all, still in his business suit, still in his business attire.
He didn't put up any resistance, so I took him by the arm and, helped him get across this parapet. He was carrying his dog, this little poodle. And so I took him by the arm and make sure he didn't blow away, as we made our way onto this helicopter, and took him over and helped lift him up into it. And the other officers, 3 or 4 of them followed, and that was it. I just told the pilot that you've got the ambassador. And they left.
All the American civilians were now out. Only the Marines were left. Hundreds of Vietnamese were left behind inside the embassy compound.
I felt maybe mad at the ambassador for not starting soon enough or getting enough of the people out earlier. I think there was a lot of resentment there at that time.
With the ambassador gone, the Marines headed for the roof, from where they would be picked up by helicopter. They were followed by desperate Vietnamese, still hoping to be taken out.
We barricaded the building on the first floor, and there were gates on every floor of the stairwell. We locked all of the stairwells. Well, in about 5 minutes, some of the Vietnamese had broken through the doors. They had taken one of the fire trucks that we had there at night. They took those vehicles and they smashed through the doors of the embassy. At the top stairwell, we barricaded it with foot lockers. And then every once in a while, we would throw a little can of CS gas or something to try to clear the stairwell. And we just kept that barricaded up. Some of the people in the stairwells were crying for us. They were holding their hands up and like praying to us to let them in, and we just couldn't let them in. There just wasn't any room for them. We got on the roof and we stayed on the roof, and then we were waiting for our helicopters, and nothing happened. We didn't have any guarantee that we were going to be rescued or the helicopters were going to come for us. We had plenty of ammunition. We had all of our rifles. If we had to do whatever we had to do, we had the equipment, we had the machine guns, we had the power to fight if we had to. But we were all just dead tired. We had been up all night evacuating people. We were just very physically exhausted at that time.
All they could do was watch the chaos below.
People were looting and carrying on, and it was just like the end of civilization. It was a free-for-all. To see people that had been in an organized society literally driving away American vehicles and looting American buildings and taking American furniture and running through the streets. I had never experienced that before.
At 7:46 a.m., the helicopters finally arrived to take Patras and his fellow Marines out of the embassy. They were the last Americans to leave Vietnam. Three hours later, the North Vietnamese troops rolled into the heart of the city. The most lurid rumors about these troops turned out to be false. They didn't pull women's fingernails out or bury people up to their necks. But they did send thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans to re-education camps.
I remember being in 6th grade, 11 years old, and watching the war on television. And it just felt surreal that here I was 10 years later, witnessing the death of a nation.
My own feeling of that was a mix. It was a mix of sadness and a good deal of anger that we, the United States, had come this road and ended our Vietnam commitment and engagement in this way.
A 20-year attempt to build a nation in South Vietnam had ended in humiliation for the Americans and personal disaster for those they left behind. Some believe the lessons of that experiment have now been forgotten.
Trying to grow a democracy in the midst of chaos and in the context of an historical culture and society is as foolish now as it was then. So there's an American messianic quality at work again, as it was then. It leads us to believe that we can go around creating our own image, recreating our own image. I'm, as you can tell, highly cynical about that.
After 3 days at sea, Long and the others on his boat were picked up by a cargo ship. He eventually made it to the US. It was another 11 years before he was reunited with his family.
If someone give me a pill for me to forget all of this, I won't take it. because I guess, you don't like the experience when you're in it, but after you survive it, after you experience the experience, it gives you so much.
Kim was arrested for collaborating with the Americans and spent 2 years in a re-education camp. On her release, she bought a small boat and escaped Vietnam on her own, also ending up in America. She was never to see her mother again.
I felt I was betrayed. I felt that they left me to die, as I left me in my country to die. That's how I felt it. It was not only betrayed, I felt betrayed, but I felt in anger. The anger that was so great that I still feel it today. I still feel it today.